Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Edwards Lecture, sponsored by Louisville Seminary. I am Claudette Snorton, and I serve as the senior pastor of Phillips Memorial Christian Methodist Episcopal Church here in Louisville. I am also the co-director of the Nehemiah Project, which is a flagship program of Louisville Seminary's Black Church Studies program, under the direction of Reverend Dr. Angela Kauser. The Edwards Lecture Series honors Dr. George Edwards and his wife, Jean. Dr. Edwards served Louisville Seminary for 27 years as a professor of New Testament. Together, the Edwards shared a ministry that was active in the Christian efforts of peace and social justice. And if you're like me, I can't think of a more needed time than now for peace and social justice.
Yes.
I will lead you in prayer and then turn our time over to Dr. Kauser, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Please bow your heads with me. Gracious Lord, we come this evening asking that this lecture time be a time of knowledge, power, and change. We ask that you give us hearts that are willing and hearts that are open as Dr. Armstrong expounds on the topic of reimaging a post-COVID-19 Black church. And we ask that you bless each of us during this time of growth. And now we ask that you bring peace and justice throughout our land and country. We also ask for a special blessing of comfort and healing and peace for the people here in Louisville. To this we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Snorton. Thank you. I have the great opportunity to introduce a friend and colleague. This is Dr. Trina Armstrong, affectionately known as Dr. Trina. She serves as the Director and Associate Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Louisville Seminary. As well as teaching pastoral counseling, Dr. Trina has served in similar capacities at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Dr. Trina holds a PhD and master's degree in pastoral theology, spiritually integrated psychology from Claremont School of Theology, a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from California Southern University, and a Master of Divinity degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Trina is a womanist, pastoral theologian, researching the impact of grief, loss, and historical trauma on the well-being of African-American families and interpersonal relationships. She has published books and articles on pastoral care for single Black mothers, pandemic grief and loss, and trauma-informed care. Dr. Trina is licensed as a marriage and family therapist in multiple states. In 2020, she founded the Center for Wellness Encounters, which is a mental health organization providing trauma-focused therapy for individuals, families, and couples. She has extensive experience in many settings as a pastoral counselor, hospice chaplain, substance abuse, crisis pregnancy, and sexual assault counselor, as a community-based systemic family therapist, and as a marriage and family therapist in several group practices. Dr. Trina is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She has served on the ministerial staff in AME churches in California, Minnesota, and Illinois. As a preacher and workshop leader, she has delivered sermons and guided groups in churches and faith-based organizations all over the United States regarding faith and healing, trauma, mental health, and grief and loss. She is a member of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, the Association of Black Psychologists, the American Psychological Association, the Society for Pastoral Theology, the American Academy of Religion, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Trina, it is a pleasure again to welcome you to Black Church Studies continuation with the Edwards Peacemaking Lecture. Friend, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that wonderful introduction. And glad to be back with Black Church Studies and specifically the Nehemiah Project. Had an opportunity to participate earlier in the year with a conversation and a lecture on mental health in the Black church. So this would be a little bit different, but weaving in the importance of mental health as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, but looking at it largely from the context of the Black church post-COVID-19. So I'm glad to be here with you all and look forward to sharing some of the findings of my research and my own experiences, just to give you a little bit of expanding on some of the things that Dr. Kauser said, primarily a professor of marriage and family therapy, but I have been in the Black church all of my life and am ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, so I have a lot of experience in Black churches and specifically experienced the COVID-19 pandemic in my home church, DuPage AME Church in Lisle, Illinois, when I was serving in the Chicagoland area. So much of what I'll share is some of those experiences and the experiences of pastors that they were interviewed, news articles, quite a bit of information on how Black churches responded to the pandemic. So we're here. President Biden declared that the emergency nature of the pandemic is essentially over. That was a couple of days ago. And so what does that mean for us? We can largely say that the pandemic, that we're back to normal. Everybody has been wanting to go back to normal. And from all intents and purposes, we can probably declare that that is the case. There's some residuals of organizations and people still masking, very little social distancing. And so, it's not completely over. People are still being infected by COVID-19. It's no longer a pandemic. It's now an endemic. It's something that will continue to be with us. One can also argue that there has been some immunity, meaning that more and more people who have been affected, who have been vaccinated, there's some natural immunity that's happening that contributes to the reduction in the number of cases and deaths. But nevertheless, the coronavirus is still with us. As we know, from its onset in March 2020, likely was present with us before then, there was a number of different shifts and changes that happened during that time that pretty much affected the whole world. And so none of us were unscathed by the pandemic, unfortunately. Disproportionately, though, those of us in the Black community know that the number of deaths in the pandemic, Black people were disproportionately represented in those numbers. As of today, about 1,150,000 people have estimated to have died in the United States. That number is a little bit over 6 million globally. The number of infections are over 100 million globally and about 65 million in the United States. Black people only represent 13% of the population in the United States. And so the number of deaths, about 155 of the 1,100,000 have been reported or counted to be Black people, though there is some theories that a number of people were unaccounted for or who contracted the virus, didn't get tested, died. And so we can't totally account for those numbers as being completely accurate. They're staggering numbers, and much of the pandemic is a public health crisis in a similar way to some of the other public health crises that we've experienced throughout our history. The Bible notes a number of different pandemics, and attributes those pandemics to the wrath of God. And so we had some of those similar explanations that happened in this pandemic, though this was not the first pandemic. It's not the first pandemic in my lifetime. I remember vividly the HIV/AIDS pandemic. I'm from California, and remember the devastating impact that it had, not only on the LGBT community. Was thought to be a gay person's disease, but it turned out that origin was in some parts of South Africa, although that hasn't been largely confirmed, but there's some theories about that. And so many people were affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. One of the things I was curious about when I was preparing for this is the church's response historically throughout pandemics have been quite fascinating. The most devastating pandemic was the Spanish flu, which killed over 100 million people worldwide. The difference in that pandemic and the coronavirus is that many of the people who were affected and died were younger people. In this case, many of the people who have died are older or who have comorbidities, which speaks to one of the reasons why Black Americans have been affected as much as the numbers suggest. And that though singularly, we can take a look at those numbers and draw some conclusions by that. And one of the ways in which I'm approaching this Edwards lecture and this topic is systemically. I'm a marriage and family therapist. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I see marriage, couples and families. I do, but marriage and family therapists are trained to think systemically. We don't give easy answers to our clients' issues, but we're also very much aware of the systemic nature of where we all sit as humans, right? So we're very much interested in social justice perspectives as in alignment with the theme of the Edwards, or the philosophy or the theory or the ethos of the Edwards lecture around social justice. Marriage and family therapists are concerned about social justice issues and how they impact the lives of families and individuals who come to us for care and healing. And that is unique because we oftentimes approach these issues with determinative answers or single answers to largely systemic issues, meaning that there's no one answer to how these pandemics and how the responses to the pandemics emerge. But we cope in different ways, and sometimes wanting easy answers is the simplest way to cope with some of the tragedies and the anxieties of what it means to be faced with a virus that is very deadly. We know that there were a number of different mutations of that virus that became deadlier and deadlier. And so that's where I'm situating this conversation. I want to start off by showing you a compilation of different conversations that was had over the news with Black pastors. And the reason why this topic is so significant in terms of the Black church is because the Black church has historically been the safe haven for Black people, as you will see in this about 20 minutes. So it's pretty engaging. So, some of the themes and some of the things, snippet of the things that emerged as a result of the pandemic are depicted in this. It's about a 20-minute segment. So the Black church historically has been the safe haven for Black people in America, and the ways in which it has been shaped and evolved as a necessary space to combat the dehumanization that Black people experienced from slavery, emancipation, and civil rights, and all of the other significant points of history that Black people have been marginalized and oppressed in. And so the one institution that has been the institution that has garnered much trust has been the Black church. And so it is no surprise that the Black church became very instrumental in being the institution that were to respond to really some of a lot of the injustices that emerged as a result of COVID-19. It was not just a public health crisis for, I want to say that all of us have been impacted. Everybody, it leveled the playing field. Although, access to vaccines and access to testing, as we look at the research, as we look at the numbers, as we hear stories of, everyone trying to access those testing and vaccines, it was clear that there was a number of different inequities in terms of how those were distributed and, who had access to particular resources and vaccines as this was unfolding, okay? So you'll see a little bit of that in the video, and I'll say more about that as I continue the lecture. I invite you all to, consider your questions for the Q&A. I want this to be, a little bit interactive. I can't say that I have all the answers. What I am going to share is some of the themes that emerged and how churches pivoted, how they recreated themselves to respond in ways that were reflective of the crisis nature, okay? But the larger questions that, for me, that came up as we are moving back into reopening church spaces is, have we gone back to the way it used to be? We know that there were a lot of concerns as though churches are still spaces for Black people. We know that the systemic injustices remain, systemic racism, structural racism. We know that all of those issues, the prevalence of disease in Black communities still persist. And so the questions that I had as I was preparing this was, what do we do now? We had wonderful responses. And so as we are going back into church spaces, as we are realizing the pandemic, that in a way that's not as devastating as it was in its onset within the first 2 or 3 years, what do we do now? How do we reimagine church spaces, considering everything that we learned, different ways that we now do ministry? Are there now opportunities to even consider ways in which we can enhance our church spaces in light of those ways in which we respond? In some ways, it seems like it's over, let's go back, and not really taking into consideration some of the ways in which the coronavirus just exacerbated existing health challenges that Black people already experience, remember, systemically, right? Because what I have learned in my own research, in my own experiences, in conversations with many organizations that I provided care for, there is a direct correlation between systemic racism and structural racism and mental health and physical health and disease. It just happened to be exposed at a larger level as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And so in some ways, it is not over for Black people. So there is no going back to normal. If nothing else, it is now an opportunity for a heightened awareness to take those things that we've learned and apply them to some of the persistent things that continue to happen in Black communities and within Black people. So I'm going to show my videos. Just give me a few seconds to set it up, and we will hear some of the experiences of Black churches' response to the pandemic.
Christianity and slavery were long intertwined. While masters believed that their religion could be used to pacify their slaves, African Americans transformed Christianity and created a new culture that would serve as the foundation of their freedom struggle.
The oldest independent African-American denomination is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in Philadelphia in 1794 by Richard Allen, the formerly enslaved Black man who purchased his own freedom.
Black religious leaders such as Reverend Allen took a strong abolitionist stance, even helping slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, some served as army chaplains, and once the war ended, many mobilized Black political participation. Some even held public office.
The Black church provided leadership opportunities for men and women who, by and large, were in subservient positions in the workforce. And so all of these preachers doing work in the Black church have been critical to giving Black people a space to envision that a different world is possible.
The late 1800s saw a dramatic proliferation of Black churches, and the church remained central to Black life through the 20th century, particularly at the height of the Civil Rights Movement.
In the 1960s, the church is playing a much more overtly militant and political role in terms of trying to organize people to defeat Jim Crow, end racism, and also to promote economic equality.
The tradition of Black religious leaders shepherding the freedom struggle reached its pinnacle with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King fused religion, nonviolent resistance, and the prophetic tradition to challenge Jim Crow, while invoking the musical legacy of the spirituals that enslaved African Americans had created. Today, the Black church remains a fundamentally important institution in the Black community.
The Black church has had to be everything to Black people because American society was unwilling to do so. Today, we don't need the church to do the same things for us, but do I think the church is still a relevant institution? Absolutely. It is the place that you can come and rebuild your spirit after you deal with the spiritual assault on Black life that many African Americans experience because of enduring histories of racism and discrimination.
Our city has placed legal consequences on groups gathering above 500. The church is not prepared for that. It doesn't work that way. It's not designed that way.
Right now, our church is 100% digital. We've moved everything online, our groups, our Bible studies, our services, and we saw great impact in that. I do believe that this crisis and pandemic is not going to change the way people view God, but I do think it will change the way people consume and view church.
Several empty pews as Seventh-day Adventist church members stayed away from service yesterday. Most churches closed their doors.
To reduce the number of people in contagious environment, no gathering with 500 people or more.
So we must have faith in God. Come and worship with Reed Temple online.
Log in, watch us live. We will still have praise and worship. In this moment, when so many people are overwhelmed with a sense of fear, we need to worship.
Several states and cities closing restaurants, bars, gyms, and movie theaters. The new guidelines tonight from the White House: avoid gatherings of 10 or more.
And I'm challenging you today to let that peace rise in your heart right now and comfort you. Hysteria never saved anybody.
Well, what we need to do, and this is absolutely critical, if we want to crush this outbreak, we've got to get the overwhelming majority of the United States population to get vaccinated, including, and I might say, even specifically Black and brown people, because of the risk that I showed you on some of those slides. And that was the reason I showed those slides, because of the increased risk of infection and serious deleterious consequences. So what Black churches, places of faith in Black and brown areas should do, since you do have an air of authority, you are trusted. You are trusted so much more than the outside non-brown black world. So when you get up there and say to your brethren and your brothers and sisters who come to your churches that it's important for you to get vaccinated, that means an awful lot.
Making sure that everyone in Baltimore, especially in low-income communities, get the vaccine and information that is necessary to do so.
The church leaders from the National Black Church Initiative gave their remarks at a park in Douglas Homes. They passed out a newspaper they put together called Vac News, which answered questions about COVID, how it spreads, and how the vaccine can protect people. It also said that black doctors say COVID-19 vaccines are good and safe for black people.
We plead with all those who are unvaccinated, given the deadly strain of the Delta virus, please, in the name of Christ, somebody say amen. Amen. Please, in the name of Christ, somebody say amen. Amen. Get vaccinated immediately.
An important message, but it was mocked and dismissed by some here.
To actually come into the hood and to see so many folk not masked, not keeping distance, much less considering the vaccine, is sort of like frustrating. But you got to start somewhere.
The vaccine rollout speeds up. Many black Americans are being left behind, and that is not sitting well with many in the faith community. Today, another Metro Atlanta black church is saying, come one, come all, and roll up your sleeves for a vaccine. Joe Ripley has more from St. Philip AME. That is a church indicator.
I believe that medicine and faith work together.
A house of worship turned into a vaccination clinic. St. Philip AME Church in DeKalb County is one of 3 Metro Atlanta churches working with Walgreens to reach communities of color.
So by partnering with them, we can give everybody in our underserved community to make sure that we can give them that equal access to the vaccine.
The goal is to vaccinate at least 2,000 people who fall under the current Georgia eligibility. Registration for the clinic was advertised through word of mouth to keep the vaccinations in the communities that need them. Uber's even offering free rides to and from the church. Senior Pastor William Watley noted the suspicion and fear among minority communities surrounding the vaccine, but believes the church opening its doors can reach them in a way other efforts can't.
There are some people who will not go to a mass vaccination site. They'll come to their church because they know their church. They trust the leadership of their church. They know the people who are helping with the process.
Pastor Greg Lewis almost died from COVID-19.
I'm going back to that bed when I was laying there helpless. I don't want people to be in that condition.
In Milwaukee, nearly 43% of all COVID-related deaths have been in the black community. It's a growing concern, so Lewis and faith-based groups recently joined together to encourage people to get vaccinations, including holding clinics in churches.
And I recommend that you take it because you don't want COVID-19.
President Biden recently launched a major push to get 70% of adults at least partially vaccinated by July 4th.
You can celebrate Independence Day free from fear or worry,
including having vaccination clinics in black-owned barbershops and salons. Vice President Kamala Harris is on a national tour to encourage vaccinations.
It's about protecting our family.
The numbers are lower among the black population, in part due to distrust in government and the medical community.
So access to services is not the same for everyone. It's just not. And it's just another reason why when we talk about health equity, we have to do a course correction.
Some pastors are even taking their message to the pulpit.
We want to continue to encourage our people to get out, get your shots. I got both of mine.
Over in Detroit, where most residents are black, only about 36% of people ages 12 and older have received at least one dose, compared to more than 60% statewide for ages 16 and older. Historic King Solomon Baptist Church has had 2 vaccination clinics. The pastor says more vaccines need to be made available at churches.
You can't tell me you're willing to fix the problem when the solution is right in front of you, yet I've got people walking in and out of here every day to get tested, and no one's here to offer them a vaccine.
Melanie Page, who has lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, had some fear after hearing about vaccine-related deaths. She's also so far avoided COVID-19.
I figured if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
But with my health issues, you know what I'm saying, and my son, he asked me, so I decided to go ahead and do it. I was more comfortable because I belong to this church and I know everybody, you know, so I've been here all my life, so that made it easier.
Making it easier.
Oh, that's it?
The goal to help reach as many people
I didn't feel it.
as possible. Carrie Andelfinger, Associated Press.
Many churches have moved their services online or outdoors. Others have reopened with capacity restrictions and mask requirements and social distancing. American Black journalist A.J. Walker visited Oak Grove AME Church to see how it has adapted over the past 2 years.
She had only been in her role a short time before Pastor Cindy Rudolph of Oak Grove AME Church had to rise to an unprecedented challenge.
I am the first female pastor here at Oak Grove, and we were very much in celebration mode when I arrived. And then 4 to 5 months into me pastoring, the pandemic hit, and so we had to pivot.
The cozy, welcoming church had to close its doors and look at new ways to reach its members and the community.
And so we had to, of course, suspend in-person worship. We had to make sure that our worship experience was available on multiple platforms. And so they can watch our online worship and worship with us as we stream online, live on Sunday mornings, on YouTube, on Facebook, on our website, on our app.
Hallelujah! To make that happen, the church had to start focusing more heavily on putting on not just a sermon, but a video production.
And so we did a complete overhaul. Cameras, lighting, sound system, microphones, because we wanted to make sure that everything we had was state of the art so that people could really feel the worship experience.
Traditional ways of collecting offerings also had to change.
And what about tithing? Because I feel like if people don't have the collection plate right there getting passed, sometimes they may be less inclined to give. Has your tithing been affected in donations?
Thank God, things have gone well for us because we, again, had to pivot in that area as well. We were already doing online giving, and so we already had that as an opportunity or an option, but we wanted to make sure that people gave in ways that was comfortable for them. And so some people are comfortable texting, and so we added text giving. Some people are comfortable using an app, and so we have app giving.
You've had to make so many changes in a very short amount of time and become experts at things you never even thought you would have to. Like the decision to offer the vaccine on site here at the church. I know a lot had to go into you deciding that.
Yes, it took prayer, it took time with God, it took research. I firmly believe that the vaccine is safe. And the reason why I was willing to serve as a vaccination site is because I did that research first and concluded that the vaccine is in fact safe. I've been vaccinated, I've been boosted, my daughter has been vaccinated, my husband has been vaccinated, my entire family, because we believe in it. We just had to redefine ourselves and find new ways to still feel connected, even though we couldn't physically be with one another. We started Oak Grove Connectors, where we trained over 50 people to become leaders, and they would reach out to members of the church and make sure that they still felt connected socially as well as spiritually. And so every week or so, they would touch base with them to make sure that they were still feeling very much a part of the community.
Healing, healing, healing for your soul. Hallelujah.
We are always called to minister to the least of these. We are always called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are always called to the love of God to people. But we have to find new ways of doing that. And so we have to adapt with each passing moment. COVID has helped us in some ways because it forced many churches to adapt technologically.
What is this space going to look like when you reopen?
I am very excited about our reopening, and we're anticipating Since we already have people who've registered, even though it's only a couple of weeks away, we're going to have a wonderful worship experience. I'm really excited about seeing members that I have not seen in months.
While Pastor Rudolph is looking forward to holding traditional service starting in April, she also looks forward to continued growth in the digital space.
Now that most churches are streaming online, it is up to us to continue to engage, not just with the people in the pews, but also with the people who are watching us online. Hybrid church is the church of the future, and we cannot ignore that. It's not enough for us to say it's just about us and our community here. We need to always be mindful of that broader audience.
We would often say a passage out of the book of Hebrews, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, which meant come to church, come to church. And then we said, don't come to church, don't come to church, don't come to church. And now we're trying to say, come back, come back, come back. Many people have found that they can do Jesus with a cup of coffee and house shoes. Nobody taught us how to do this.
The Black church as an institution has been radically transformed over the past 3 years. Before the pandemic, only a fraction of Black churches nationwide had any kind of digital capacity. Of the 30,000 members represented by the Conference of National Black Churches, only about 500 of those were streaming when COVID-19 hit. Most were forced to close completely, only re-emerging months later after finding ways to pivot and reinvent themselves.
Again, there's a theological question being raised for the church, not the Black church, but the church in general. Because all of our emphasis has been on how do we get more viewers, but we're not called to make viewers. We're called to make disciples. So guys who, like me, who were used to maybe speaking 45, 50 minutes, maybe an hour on a crazy day, now you got to cut back to 25 minutes, 30 minutes. If I go 40 minutes, I'm long.
So how did you manage the struggle of this transition personally?
It was tough. It was tough. It was tough. There's an intimacy between the style of Black preaching where, I say something and you respond, go call and respond.
When they said this, you can accuse us of a lot of things, but you can't accuse us of being boring.
Well, if there's nobody to respond, what are you going to do? And I know some guys who struggle with that, just psychologically and, looking into that camera, I struggle with it myself.
Others have a different take.
Call and response is nice. I was trained to preach that way. Well, I'm for all that, okay? But it's a nice experience. It's a nice cultural experience. Mm-hmm. But to be honest about it, that's not the foundation of the teaching long term. Christians think that church is established the way we do it by God. It's not. A lot of this is the Catholic model that's been modernized by the Protestants. It's just and then it's been jazzed up by the Pentecostals. So the idea of coming every Sunday, Sunday morning, Sunday night, 2 and 3 services, like we were having 4 services a weekend, it's a killer.
Temple's ministry, which began its digital shift back in 2007, was one of the few prepared to go fully online when COVID-19 hit.
I realized that digital, once I understood it, was even more effective than television. And I realized that you could be more specific, you can target your audience. It didn't cost as much money. Oh my goodness.
By March 2020, 65% of Temple's income was already online. Today, that number has grown to 97%. In addition to that, his congregation gave 30% more money digitally. The benefits of digital are hard to deny. So we're here outside the historic Fame Church, First African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1872 by former slave Biddy Mason.
The congregation has been resilient, however. They knew what the church had done in pre-pandemic, and so they brought the needs to make certain that the church stayed open. We missed 1 month and doing our food distribution. But the following month, we found ways to package food to have people come by, open your trunk, we'll drop the capsule of food in your trunk, and we'll close your trunk, and you drive off.
Pastor Boyd of Fame sees the benefits of online for his congregants, who previously had to drive 40 or 50 miles to church every Sunday. But he also acknowledges the loss of intimacy.
There's some people who actually need a hug, and need a hug from their pastor, from their leader, because they see a pastor as being the connection between them and God. So a hug from their pastor on Sunday morning was the psychological, the emotional fueling, if you will, that got them through the week. Personally, for me, it's been a learning curve. Yeah, I've had to live on some of the things that I preached about, which is faith and determination.
The Conference of National Black Churches, which represents some 20 million people, or more than 80% of historically black churches nationwide, partnered with the CDC early on to overcome vaccine hesitancy, initiating training and education efforts with 3,000 pastors a year. By 2022, the conference's member churches had facilitated more than 500,000 vaccinations nationwide. A Brookings Institute study found that black churches boost racial equity in COVID-19 prevention outcomes, while a Pew study found that the vaccination gap had closed, in part because of partnerships between black church leaders and healthcare and vaccine providers. By now, it has become crystal clear to everyone that the black church is desperately needed during times of crisis and beyond.
So lots of really good information about not only the nature of the crisis, snippets of how it affected Black communities and how Black churches responded as a significant pillar in Black communities. What it doesn't say, so as you know, whatever thoughts that you have about that particular video, there is some, in my research, I was able to learn about many pastors, a lot of Zoom conversations between pastors from all over the country who pretty much agree with many of the things that you saw on the video about how it impacted them personally, how it impacted their churches, and a little bit about how it affected their members. A lot of what we don't hear is some of the significance of the magnitude of the crisis, was immediate response to the crisis, because as we end services in the Black church, typically after a sermon is completed, there's an altar call. I know this happens in the AME church, and one of the things that many pastors say is the doors of the church are open. In a literal sense, right? It's an invitation for persons to either come to Christ or join the church, or in some instances, to be part of the larger church ministry. And so many of those pastors and churches, and this was true of churches throughout the country, it's not just a Black thing, but particularly because of the significance of Black churches, those doors were shuttered, and it did cause significant distress. And there was a lot of controversy that wasn't noted in that video, because there was in some states, the masking requirements, social distancing wasn't honored. In fact, we know that there was lawsuits by certain constituencies about closures of certain organizations. That would be true in the Black church. Many Black pastors were hesitant because they saw the church as an essential service. We know that essential services were allowed to go on, even though many of the essential workers are Black people. There was a number of essential workers who actually contracted the coronavirus and lost their lives because of the essential nature of their jobs. But additionally, some of the church leaders considered themselves as essential services, but according to the CDC guidelines and the number of persons gathering, it didn't meet that criteria. But some of them were still willing to take a chance and allow their churches to still be open and invite people into those churches, which was a risk. And so there was a lot of conversations with public health officials in a lot of states and cities and counties that really encouraged those pastors to take seriously the lives of the people that were putting in jeopardy. And fortunately, many of those pastors did heed those warnings and keep their doors closed and pivoted to different types of ministries. One of the things that is really, as I think about the magnitude of the losses that occurred over the course of the last 3 years, there's many ways in which those aren't necessarily, and I'll show you a clip of that. If you put the coronavirus in context, much of what has been the focus is deaths and getting as many people as vaccinated as possible. There was a lot of hesitancy, as you saw in the video, because historically the healthcare system has not been, has not been favorable to Black people. There's been a lot of experiences. The significant one was the Tuskegee Health experiment around syphilis. And so there's a lot of mistrust and inequities in ways as the Black people don't feel like their needs will be served by going to healthcare organizations. And so you saw Dr. Fauci really recognizing the significance of the Black church, even using a little bit of, King James type language, brethren, to encourage Black pastors to encourage their members. And so you saw a little bit of the ways in which some of those churches acknowledge that the authority that Black churches have are favorable in getting Black people vaccinated. But, what gets lost in all of that is all of these losses, okay? A number of different losses. This is just a small sample of them. And loss of death and illness in ways that family members weren't able to visit their loved ones, the number of rites of passage of things that many young people were not able to experience because of the pivot to online learning, the ways in which many jobs pivoted to online, and that meant that parents and children had to be together in ways that caused some stress. That would be true of families and relationships. And so many of that came across a lot of therapist desks. Therapists had to pivot to online spaces and got really overwhelmed by all of the ways in which people needed care because of the stressors that they were experiencing from these different situations that they had not experienced. Loss of future, loss of endings. Many people lost businesses and jobs and homes, and loss of safety, relationships. There was a lot of isolation and loneliness that some of these pastors alluded to. And though they tried to be really creative about how to address some of that, some are more advantageous than others. Those who didn't have any family at all, that it's not as easy to find safe spaces and a sense of connection when you're going into a crisis and not having access to perhaps the only space that you can experience community. And so there was a lot of suicide. In fact, in 2020, 4 months into the pandemic, I lost a brother to suicide. He had schizophrenia and was forced to isolate. And so we experienced a lot of what many other families may have experienced. It took us almost 2 months to get his body released from the mortuary because the mortuary and the funeral homes were so filled with not only the normal deaths, but the pandemic related deaths, the COVID deaths. And so that was pretty stressful for my family, and we had to limit the funeral to only a certain number of people. And so I experienced firsthand the unfortunate result of what it means to mourn a family member in the context of a pandemic. And so, I can say that much of that we had to endure by ourselves. Prayer and everything were things that we received, but there wasn't a lot of grief counseling and some of those things that take into account some of these ways in which all of us may have experienced some of this stuff. And as we think about going back to normal, these kind of experiences don't just go away. In fact, a research that I did on the Spanish flu, one of the things that I learned through that research was from the American perspective, there is always, when there is a crisis, there is always this sense of let's just move forward, right? This way in which we pause. And there's been some of that, right? Some of the churches have, Black churches that I'm familiar with have had, services, not in a large, I think the focus that pastors were just so tired and exhausted that they did what they knew how to do. And they didn't know any of those things. They didn't have education and learning, and those who had the resources definitely had an advantage, but there were a lot of small churches that really struggled. And unfortunately, some of those small churches closed. We know that many Black churches are, disproportionately represented by people probably 55 and older. And so some of the technological changes that many people just weren't familiar with, the bandwidth of technology, particularly in rural places where churches are, where they just don't have access to that type of technology. And so a lot of ways in which complications were just very apparent in addition to some of the social justice issues. But then again, those are social justice issues, right? And how do we now step back, right, and feel like we can go back to normal without taking into consideration the ways in which some of these things have really impacted a lot of Black life. We know that in the midst of some of these, all of the things that were going on with the virus, we had the continued police violence that was happening. We had George Floyd, that was a few months into the pandemic, other police violence that was also, so there's this ongoing way in that there was always this push and pull of, fighting the coronavirus, making sure churches had offer spaces to deal with all of those stresses. And at the same time, trying to be attentive to the ways in which some of these enduring social justice issues still need our attention. It's a lot to ask of churches. Churches are no longer the Martin Luther King churches, the civil rights era. There's some of that, again, a lot of it's crisis oriented, right? This initial response to this crisis, and then we go back to normal until the next crisis happens, okay? And that is, unfortunately, gets us in a cycle of not really stepping back and thinking of the ways in which we can better respond, provide foundational aspects of society in a way that allows for Black lives to really flourish, okay? And so not a lot of attention to that. So as I think, if I step back and I reflect on all of the ways in which I researched and listened to a lot of conversations, one of the things that I'm always mindful of is a crisis is an opportunity, okay? This is crisis theory, that whenever we have a crisis, it's not necessarily the crisis that is the issue and concern. It is how we perceive the crisis, right? Many people were ready to go back to normal, we're tired of quarantining and isolation, didn't have a sense of being, integrated in a larger society. It was very selfish and, about them, right? We saw a lot of that, including, in Black communities as well, right? So there is a difference in, affluent Black communities and those who are a little bit more impoverished, who do not have the privilege of doing things like social distancing and have access to certain things. So there is even, separation and division even in Black communities. But if we think about all of the ways in which what I've learned as part of this and what churches have learned themselves based on their responses, is they had to do creative ministry, okay? So this crisis meant that we have to do something different, okay? Hence the opportunity. It could be a danger. We can succumb to the nature of the crisis, or we can see the crisis as an opportunity to do something different. And that really is the thing that helps us to reimagine the Black church, as it is still one of the foundational organizations and places where Black people feel safe. But we also know that some of the ways in which Black churches have pivoted can also present concerns, okay? Many of these churches have gone digital, as many as could afford sophisticated ways of going digital. Some churches have, I know I have friends that, have an iPad up on a stand, and that's the way that they project their services. And so, really creative ways to commit to having their churches online, having access to larger communities, which in and of itself, yes, is about numbers, as some of the pastors said in the video, but also what do we do with a divided congregation as we're inviting this global way of people seeing Black churches and having really two different congregations and people all over the world having access to different churches. There are concerns. People can church hop in different ways, right? We can do church at home. And so there's a focus on a particular, maybe I just want to see the sermon and I don't want to see all that other stuff. But in some ways, how does that impact the larger spiritual aspect of the church experience? It's just peeking in. Does church now become spectator sport, right? For entertainment, I'll look at so where do we see opportunities to do spiritual formation when we have such a fragmented way of doing church in some ways? And so those were some of the concerns that that both pastors noted, but also really feeling proud of themselves for pivoting in ways that were, met the needs of their congregations and actually partnering with health organizations to get the virus out. And so what we learned about that is that these disparities, the reason why we have all of these disparities. So it's nothing new, but it gets heightened. What we learned is that churches had to be intentional about ministry. Black churches had to be intentional in ways that they, maybe hadn't done before. They had to, many churches supported the smaller churches. Those who had means were able to provide resources to those smaller churches. Some churches had to really reckon with that mistrust and, to acknowledge the fears that Black people were having. And some of the pastors and leaders had fears of their own, and they had to model that for their congregations. So we learned that we can transcend some of those fears when we have intentional conversations about science, right? Sometimes there is a way that spirituality is divided, right? Spirituality and versus the essence of the biological part of it, the science aspect of who we are as humans. Oftentimes it doesn't have the specific focus as our spiritual lives. And so in this way, we had to trust the science. Of course, there's still some who haven't been vaccinated and don't plan to get vaccinated, but many Black churches did model that and did trust science, did bring in doctors, did have intentional conversations, did do the research, as you heard from Pastor Cindy Rudolph, that they felt confident that the vaccinations were safe and that they could open up their sites for vaccination sites, and that we could now think in ways in which we can have a larger conversations about how we can also respond in different ways to some of the other chronic and persistent diseases that Black people still endure. We know that now pastors have the capacity for creativity, that they can do something different. That we also have opportunities to look at this in terms of the systemic nature, which is a little bit different than some of the civil rights eras. It's a little bit more subtle and in ways in which how we can mobilize differently. We know that Black Lives Matter in some ways resorted to some of the marching and some of those old ways of activism, but that perhaps there are other ways now. Many of the churches empowered their churches in different ways to help do the ministry and took advantage of some of the gifts and skills, like a lot of the pastors who didn't have technological skills, relied on the young people in their congregations. We know that in some churches, young people aren't always giving the opportunity to do ministry in different ways, but in this way, the pastors recognize that this is a generation that was pretty much born into technology. And so naturally, they're going to have gifts to be able to support the church in that way. And so there were a lot of different ways that many, many new learnings emerged out of this. And so what are the opportunities now? Have we gone back to normal? What about all of these continued concerns? Can we be the church who is as intentional as it was in the height of the pandemic as we continue to go forward, especially when many of the concerns that Black people face aren't over? What we know now is we can mobilize in ways similar to the civil rights. There is some, there's some criticism as to whether or not the church was actually involved in the civil rights movement. But we know that the church was a safe space, and we know that many of the people who were part of the civil rights movement was actively involved, were powerful activists, and we know that the church has the capacity to do that. We also know that there is a significant way in which the younger generation is coming behind us, right? Really aren't interested in church in a way that some of the older generations, Generation X, the baby boomers. And so in some ways, is this an opportunity to create a different church for this new emerging generation that is already technologically savvy, that have different ways of exercising their voice? They don't need to be in church. Is our model of ministry conducive to the ways in which we now have access to social media and different ways that we're getting information and exercising our voice? Is the model of the pastor being the solo voice in the worship service the model that we want to continue, considering that this generation is a little bit more impatient about that? So those are the things that I bring to our attention for conversation and questions, and just to really think, how can we reimagine the Black church? How can we? Did some wonderful things, but is this all an opportunity to take what we learned, to be committed to the ways in which we did intentional ministry, expand upon that, and welcome a new generation? Is this an opportunity to be more inclusive? Is this an opportunity to really take advantage of all of the gifts of women, children, teenagers, our LGBTQI brothers and sisters, our elderly, all of the constituencies in Black communities? Is this an opportunity to see how a global pandemic impacted all of us in ways that God can now speak through the Black church in ways that reaches everyone in their particular communities? So I'll stop there and I'll invite your questions. I'll invite your comments, and even ways in which your churches have pivoted, things that you all learned, things that you can relate to from the video. So this is an opportunity for us to have some conversation.
All right, Dr. Trina, somebody has already put a question, Chaplain McNeil. And we're going to ask everyone who has a question to please put it in the chat rather than the Q&A. But Chaplain McNeil asks, you mentioned concerns. What opportunities did pastors speak about regarding congregant spiritual formation in the digital environment?
Good question. And I would say not much. The focus seemed to be on viewership and access to the worship services. Many pastors were having to reimagine different ways of preaching. And I don't know if that's changed much, just coming out of the Good Friday experience and taking advantage of all the ways in which you have access to, different Black pastors, but not much was said, and I did quite a bit of research, really looking at a lot of different conversations between pastors, a lot of articles where pastors were interviewed, a lot of just really helpful conversations. But the biggest absence was spiritual formation. Church attendance doesn't necessarily equate to spiritual formation. There was a little bit of talk about care, mostly focusing the immediate care and needs, the typical ministries that many churches have, feeding ministries and those types of things, but not a lot of acknowledgement of some of the ways in which families and a lot of discord and tension happen in those families. So not a lot of conversations about what do we do going forward. And so an aspect of spiritual formation, taking into account all of the ways in which our lives are intertwined in many aspects of our lives outside of the church. But this continued focus on how many people can we reach? So I see that as an opportunity to think about how can we do spiritual formation when we have so many people watching, and many of the pastors talked about the need to consider their worship spaces now more globally and not as they are speaking to local congregations. Although there are still a number of churches, I look at a number of different churches online myself, and some of those, I look at my home church, and even though we have people who are not in the particular community where the church is located, it's still a conversation about the people who are, that's their home church, versus people who are, there's a little bit of acknowledgement, hey, we want to say hi to the people who are virtual, but no real indications about spiritual formation, how that's going to happen. And so, so it is a concern. And I didn't hear any
question. Nobody wanted to, but I have one. One of the persons in the video you mentioned spoke of how their financial picture increased through digital giving. That doesn't always appear to be the norm. In your conversations, how has that been addressed? We have these worldwide audiences. I know I've even had some of our seminary classmates who are overseas who watch my worship services digitally, but that doesn't always translate into increased giving. How did they address that, or speak of how they were successful or how they are trying to manage that?
Yeah, and that's not, I'm very much aware that that's not the true, as you said, that's not true for every church. In fact, if we were to consider the Black churches throughout the United States, the larger churches are not the norm. Most Black churches are going to be the smaller churches, rural churches. In some of the conferences that I've, served on in congregations, you can take the folks in those churches and, create a larger congregations and still won't have 200 people. So there's a lot of even churches in my denomination that are very small churches and who I know struggled. But many of them did say that they recognized that there was some increase in ways that people were giving online. In some ways, that was an increase on how they were giving in person. They just acknowledged that. Even some of the larger churches, they just acknowledged that the giving increased. And I would say that I know that many of the actual tithers represent a particular constituency of the congregation. Those are going to be the ones who, have traditional notions of ministry and tithing and are going to be committed to the church in different ways. And then, maybe the Gen Zs, the millennials, who aren't always in church, but there are quite a few churches who do have quite a bit of younger congregants. But there is no real indication of the percentage of who is actually contributing to that increase. Is it because of different people who are watching church services who are now giving in ways? Does it contribute to the number of people who are now viewing and are able to contribute to that ministry in ways that people who are just in the local congregation can't, right? So that would require a little bit more research to see what some of the trends are, but the churches could only acknowledge that their giving increased, and they couldn't really say what contributed to that. I know that, there were some conversations in my church, there's ways in which who the major tithers are, the major, folks who are contributing to those churches, and there's times when there's an additional ask to cover certain expenses and those types of things. So there's a number of different ways that I think contributed to that, but nothing definitively that I can say. Only that, there were some trends in some churches that, tithing increased, giving increased. And it could be because of the ease of giving now. There's different ways, Giveify and Cash App and those kind of things that for some people make it easy to give instead of just writing a check. But I don't know for sure. And I don't think the pastors that I researched and the conversations that I heard across all of the videos that I reviewed, none of them seem to have a way in which they knew for sure why that was the case.
Okay, a question from Luis Andres Eneo. Please excuse if I didn't pronounce it correctly. Says, I am a reporter for the Associated Press on the Global Religion team. A recent Pew Research Center survey found that the number of Black Protestants who say they attend monthly fell from 61% in 2019 to 46% now, 15 percentage points. No other religious group has registered a decline of this magnitude. Black Protestants are also the only group in which more than half, 54%, still attend services virtually. What are your thoughts on these findings? And what are the challenges and opportunities, especially for young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that as I was, immersing myself in all of this data, right, the different ways of collecting data and listening to these pastors, in some ways, I've been in a number of different churches, from small to large churches, and recognize that in part that decline is likely a reflection of the different ways of experiencing church by the emerging generations. There is significant research. Brianna Parker, who has an organization called the Millennial Cafe, has done significant research on that generation of young African Americans who are probably now closer to 40 now, and youngest in their 30s. She's also doing a lot of research. She's expanded that to look at different ways that the Black church is evolving in ways that invites different ways of being church, recognizing the significance of church, like you noted. But there is quite a bit of research that says the younger generation is not attending church, that there are some concerns about church leadership, as much as there are some who are Gen X, baby boomers, and those generations who have, generational trust of church leaders. There's a significant amount of this younger generation who has mistrust. I think that there are ways in which some of the scandals and different ways in that they're able to see church differently than maybe some of the older generations didn't, and that they don't find that those spaces are helpful. There's also some concern about spiritual formation, that some of the ways in which preaching and the lack of thereof of spiritual formation doesn't apply to their lives, that they can find other spaces to do that, that they have access to different ways of experiencing spirituality in different spaces that doesn't require them to be in a Black church or to be in church, period. And so those are some of the things that sort of emerged in researching, the generational Z, which is right behind the millennials. We don't know enough about, other than that is likely going to be a continuation of the millennials, right? That, though they are less and less inclined to experience church as safe spaces, particularly younger Black women who are now doing other alternative types of ministries because they don't feel like they have access to church leadership positions. They're still not, honored as receiving larger appointments and those kind of things. And so, I think the ministry terrain in Black community and Black churches is shifting largely. And as this population, the Gen X's and the baby boomers and the whatever that other generation is, as they decline and, eventually die off, it's going to be a different church. And a lot of that's just not going to be conducive to the this younger congregation. And they're more, I think the concerns is sort of this digital ministry. So that digital ministry was in many ways present even before the coronavirus, right? This largely pivot. And so there were ways in which many people were already doing digital church hopping, right? And finding particular conversations and sermons that really spoke to them, but not in a way that is contributing. There are some theories. I'm not a homiletician. I do believe that preaching does in some ways transform, but I also know transformation is a little bit more integrated in terms of a number of different ways in which we can experience transformation that may not always be happening in Black church spaces. And so I would say that contributes to it. And I think that this new way of doing church is significant. I know there have been times where I didn't want to go to church because of the convenience of it. And we're now in a social media world. I don't think that we are, as a Black community, there's a ministry that talks about the digital divide that has a number of Black pastors and ministry leaders on a board that have had conversations and talked about the digital divide in ways in which, we're still behind in being able to take advantage of technology, not only just in church spaces, but in general. And so I see that, that's both an opportunity and a concern, but I don't see it as a concern with the younger generation. So, which may attest to ways that the 50% still attend those services virtually, because they don't want to be a part of the larger church, right? There are some critics who say that, there are in ways in which the church, they've left Black churches there, that they don't find that the church is healthy, but they may be okay with listening to sermons, right? So they get to pick and choose. And a lot of pastors noted that was a concern. They don't have to watch it on Sunday, they can watch it on Thursday. So now people get to pick and choose. They have options, right? So that could both contribute to the decline and also contribute to the increase in ways in which people are taking advantage of churches virtually, right? It's just a different way of doing church now.
All righty. Willis Ritchie asks, what effect do you think the changes you have addressed will have on congregational polity and its place in the life and ministry of churches so based or organized?
Yeah, that's an important question. We are, I have been, so I'm in a heavily organized and hierarchical African Methodist Episcopal Church, and really paying attention to the ways in which does that kind of structure organization, is that still relevant to this season, right, of ministry and this emerging way of, even social justice perspectives, right? There's a heavily focused, like interior focus on the organization of the church, the denomination, okay? A lot of meetings, right? A lot of annual conferences, a lot of those things that are happening, right? Ways in which, the financial aspects of the church, there's a question about the financial aspects of the church, but that churches, are still asked to contribute to the larger denominational concerns of the church, okay? And many of the churches, right, that's albatross because they have either smaller congregations, aged congregations, and they can't contribute. So they have to do all of these creative ways to make sure a lot of their appointments are tied to the financial giving of the church. There doesn't seem to be as big of a concern or the spiritual formation. So a lot of focus is on giving, a lot of focus is on numbers, and not a lot of conversation about, looking at the health of the spiritual aspects of congregations. There's some reform conversations going on in the AME church. So there's a little bit of movement happening, but I don't see it having any significant change. I think that's been one of the things that probably has been a little bit disappointing, is resuming some of those ways of hierarchy and organization that existed before the pandemic, right? And so, those organizations just switched to online, still had their annual conferences, and benefited in some ways because they didn't have to pay for hotels or travel, but, churches were still asked to give. So I think that there are some polity concerns that we have to address. Whether or not, pastors and organizational leaders are committed to making those changes, I don't see that happening. I can say for sure in my denomination, I don't see that happening. I see church as usual. Annual conferences are being had. Pastors are asked to, continue to contribute to the larger districts and denominations. There's, like I said, there is a little bit of movement of having polity changes, but I don't see it happening in any significant ways anytime soon. Which begs the question, are we going back to the way of doing church? How has the pandemic impacted us? All of the losses, is it just about doing church as usual, right? So I don't, that's an ongoing concern of mine, and also many of the pastors that are part of my denomination, but a lot of them, that's their livelihood. And so they don't want to, make any, intentional, they don't want to disrupt the things that are already happening. Because that's their livelihood for many of the churches, and their organizational structure probably isn't conducive to those kind of radical voices that are asking for significant changes in the way that we do church. And so, these ways of doing church are, have been around for a long time. So it's going to take some significant, I would say, interchurch advocacy, or as a lot of people are predicting, at least in my denomination, is it going to take the church dying, for churches to realize that they really need to do something different. So that's a real concern in the AME church. Sure, there are different churches larger churches who, many of them that were on that video, who had a capacity to sustain their ministries, but that's not the bulk of our churches. And so the concern is, are we going to die? Are some of the polity issues, constraining some of the ways in which we're not doing ministry holistically, that with a focus on our communities, systemic and structural change? If it's all about the denomination, which it appears to be in many, then that's not going to make any significant changes in our society. So, especially as it relates to Black flourishing. So, but it's not to say that what they're doing isn't contributing to, a lot of people still value the Black church. But I think just as the younger congregation is coming behind us, that would be the only way that I can see them really pushing for systemic change. But many of them were mentored by people who are the ones who are the leaders. So typically what we find is sort of the intergenerational passing on of ways of doing church. And so the commitment that people have to that, the power that comes with that, don't always mean that they can actually make these big systemic changes that really can alter the way that we're doing church now. So that's my thought on that. Really complex in a lot of different ways, especially being embedded in a denomination that's heavily organized, hierarchical, in so many ways in which it looks like a political system instead of a church.
All right, thank you. Dr. Trina, Dr. Kauser?
Yes, ma'am.
It's on you.
I am glad to sum up what I think I heard, the major trends and dialectics that I heard from Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Trina tonight. What I really heard, Dr. Trina, was a dialectic between life and death. If we want to live, is this an opportunity, a fertile opportunity to change, or is it an opportunity to continue business as usual with the emphasis on business and usual practices? Two, you indicate that there was great loss in the pandemic on multiple levels of human existence, but there's also elements of gain. And that gain oftentimes came because of loss, that people were forced, and institutions may have been forced to change because of the pandemic, because of the virus and what it forced churches to do. I heard you talk about, especially around attendance. What counts as attendance now is very different than it was, I think, before. And there's gain there online, but there's also great loss and longing around what used to be. The ways that people used to be able to touch and hug and have physical closeness that is lost for many, many people. I heard you talk about technology both as gain, as equilibrium for some churches for whom it's not new, and again as loss for other people and other institutions that may not have had the money or the resources to respond in ways that they needed to, but also larger churches who were already in the digital space, who were able to capitalize on that and grow. And then I heard there was a very interesting comment from one of the pastors who said, I used to hoop and I used to do the hoop, but now I don't get a response from my hoop, from the camera. So what do I do? So now we have to rethink really every element of worship and what is it to have people in person and people online. My goodness, it has shifted everything. And then finally, you talk about denominational structures that are not unusual, but that feel unreformed, if you will, unexamined for this new era. And there's danger in that. You indicate earlier that young folk, many of them are not coming to churches and are going to other spaces for spiritual nourishment and community. So anything else you want to add on the major themes and shifts that you lifted up tonight?
Oh, I think you captured it wonderfully. And as I hear you reflect on it, my heart got heavy. But I think at the center for me, particularly as a pastoral theologian and one who is in the trenches with people who are hurting, is still, one of the things I didn't really focus on as much as, as I think about all of those losses, is the mental health concerns that, racial disparities contribute to some of that stuff. And yes, we recognize that in the history of the Black church, it is a safe space, but we need more than safe spaces. Dale Andrews talks about the church as a refuge, but we need more than a refuge. We need healing. We need to be able to, considering all of the things that are happening in Black communities, which are no longer centralized anymore as a result of gentrification, as a result of class differences. So, Blackness is much more diverse now. But I think one of the things that we all have in common is the ways in which, regardless of where we live, is the ways in which racism still impacts us, right? This generational, continued generational passing on of trauma, whatever, it don't matter, right? And that is not really a focus. Taking all of those things that we just reflected on and situate that into mental health and well-being. And many of the pastors talk about their own mental health, and wanting to be a little bit more transparent with their congregants in a way to invite more transparency into their own church spaces. And I think one of the things that I really took away from this opportunity to reflect on all of this was partnership, right? That there are ways, there are many different resources that are available. The ways in which, right, it's not always about having the money, right? It's about having access to resources that help Black people flourish. We know that the Black church can be central in that, but this way in which we can now have more of an emphasis on not, there's, a lot of times we're building buildings, but instead of building up our people through partnership with other organizations, whether that's therapists, nonprofit organizations, health organizations, to address some of these needs. So I think that would be a huge theme that really is at the center of my work. So just wanted to add that piece to all of the other things that we just lifted up as major themes.
Thank you for that, Trina. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. And you hit on that. Use the word hit. You themed that in your lectures in February. You and Dr. Greer and the persons who did the presentations and the breakout sessions around these very themes. Let me summarize them in prayer, if you would. Let us pray, church. We thank you, dear God, for this scholar of the church, Dr. Trina, this scholar of healing, this minister of love, this therapist of compassion. We bless her yearning for a church that is a whole space for the whole people, the whole person, the whole community of faith. We yearn for a church that is a space of challenge, love, healing, and grace in all the ways that people need it. We thank you for the vision laid up tonight by Dr. Trina, and we bless all who attended here tonight that they take up this mantle to initiate relationships, create pathways of whole health and whole healing for our people. For if not the church, And if not Jesus, whence cometh our help? Bless us now as we depart this space, but never, oh God, from your presence. We thank you for our brother Jesus, the wisdom in the Holy Spirit, and the God who is our creator. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, friends. We will see you again, we hope, this time next year, where we'll take up again all of the issues that are important to Black churches and to the people that love Black churches and who love the gospel of Jesus Christ. We bless you and we thank you.